As we continue on this lesson of forgiveness, we've already spoken of making sure that we seek God's forgiveness for ourselves and God's forgiveness for the sins of others, who maybe they commit those sins to us or they commit those sins around us, and for the sins of our nation. And we spoke about 2 Chronicles 7:14, where it says that we are to pray for the nation by praying for ourselves and asking God to forgive us of our sins so that our nation can be forgiven. If we have unconfessed sin between us and God, then God cannot answer our prayer of confession for our nation's sins. So it's important that we remember that. After we see this section, we come into forgiving so that God can forgive us. We are to forgive other people so that God will forgive us. Now, this is not for salvation. Salvation forgiveness is given automatically when you receive Christ. That forgiveness is there and you're accepting the forgiveness Jesus already gave for every sin you'll ever commit. That means you don't have to be punished for those sins that you may commit by going to hell. However, we are to keep the relationship between us and God open by seeking His forgiveness for our sins against others, or seeking His forgiveness so that we can be forgiven, and we are to forgive others so that we can be forgiven. God says, forgive so I can forgive you. Mark 11:25, and when ye stand praying, forgive if ye have aught against any. So when we come to prayer, maybe it's at church, maybe it's at home, we come to prayer and we have an unforgiving spirit towards someone else. God says, don't even pray. He says, forgive that person. Now, maybe you cannot forgive that person in person. You're not beside them. You can't call them. Maybe it's too late at night. Maybe it's too early in the morning. Maybe you're in the middle of church, whatever it might be. But you can tell God that you are forgiving that person. Now, you should tell the person at some point that you've forgiven them. But at that moment, you can tell God that you're forgiving them so that the door of prayer can be open between you and God. The communication can be there. So he says, if you have aught against any, make sure you forgive them, that your Father also, which is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. But if ye do not forgive, neither will your Father, which is in heaven, forgive your trespasses. God says on a daily basis, if we have an unforgiving spirit towards anyone, and we don't confess that, we don't forgive them, we don't confess it to God, then God cannot forgive us. And that door of communication between us and God is blocked. It's closed. Does that mean God doesn't hear us anymore? He can hear us, but it does mean that He will not answer. He's not going to answer your request when you have an unforgiving spirit towards someone. So God tells us we're to forgive others so that we can be forgiven. The first people we should forgive are family. Family hurts are one of the hardest things, I think, for people to forgive. Genesis 50 verse 16. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face. And they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them, and spake kindly unto them. This is Joseph in Egypt. He's now second in command of Egypt. His brothers have come to him for food because of the famine, and Joseph saves not only them, but the entire nation of Egypt and basically the known world, because Egypt was the only place that had prepared for the famine, because they were the only ones who knew that the famine was coming. So Joseph has saved his brothers and their families, even though they had tried to harm him. If you go back in time to when Joseph was a young man, he was taken by his brothers. They didn't like him, they were jealous of him. He was taken by them, thrown into a pit, and the brothers had planned to kill him. And then they saw a group of slave drivers coming by, headed to Egypt, and they decided instead, why do we want to kill him? We can make money off of him. And so they sell Joseph into slavery. Now, I have not heard of anyone I know who has been sold into slavery by their family. Perhaps people can go back in time to the time of the slaves here in America or in other country where they may have come from. Perhaps they would have family and relatives from way back who would have been sold into slavery. Maybe some people who've come from some modern day countries that still practice slavery. Perhaps they could have been sold into slavery and escaped and been able to come to America or a country where they're cared for and people treat them correctly. But in most cases, I would say most people have not been sold into slavery by their family. But here's Joseph sold into slavery. Not only is he sold into slavery, when he gets to Egypt and he's serving in a house, he's falsely accused and thrown into prison for several years. When he finally comes out, God puts him as second in command in Egypt. And Joseph, he interprets the king's dreams, which tell that there's going to be a famine. And Joseph tells the king how to prepare for the famine, and he saves the known world at the time from starvation because of his preparation and belief that God was telling him what he needed to do. So here's Joseph. He learned to forgive, and because he had a forgiving spirit, God was able to use him in a great way. People with an unforgiving spirit cannot be used in a great way by God because they're not allowing God to work through them. So we must learn to forgive family hurts. I think Joseph is the greatest example of this, having forgiven his brothers who hated him and were jealous of him. Some people have been hurt horribly by family. Some people have been abused physically, emotionally, sexually by family members. Maybe it was an uncle, a grandfather, a brother, whoever. Maybe they sexually abused you. Maybe it was that you were abused by your parents and they beat you and treated you terrible. Maybe you felt emotionally abused because your parent, you felt like they loved another child more than you. There's so many different types of family hurts. Maybe your brothers and sisters, you're older. You could be adults now, and someone has done something you feel hurt you, your family, your children, whatever it might be, and you have an unforgiving spirit towards that person. You've allowed that grudge to build a wall, and you haven't spoken to that person in years. I know families like this. I've seen families act like this. I've seen families where one brother or sister refused to come around for years because of a hurt that they felt they received from someone. And I don't claim that my family's perfect. There's been times, even as adults, my brothers and sisters and I have disagreed on something. But we try to make sure that we forgive each other and we keep those lines of communication open between us. Because I would hate to stand before God knowing that I had not forgiven a brother or sister for something that I felt they did to me. I would hate to stand before God and feel like I was standing there with a grudge against my parents for something that I felt they did to me. I would hate to stand before God and hold a grudge towards anyone in my family that I felt might have done something wrong to me. So God calls us to forgive our family hurts. It's not easy. I think forgiving a family hurt, someone who's very close to you, who harms you in some way, whether mentally, emotionally, physically, I believe that's probably one of the hardest things to forgive. Yet God calls us to do so if we want to have His forgiveness for us. When you're forgiving family and you think of your parents, maybe you look at your parents and you say, you don't know my parents. You don't know the wicked life they live. You don't know what they did to me. You don't know what they allowed to happen to me. I can't honor them. And when I was in college, a lady spoke and she said, I know many of you may have come from homes where you feel you cannot honor your parents. They're not Christians maybe, or they harmed you, whatever the case might be, but you feel you cannot honor them. And she said, if you feel that you cannot honor your parents by your actions, by trying to love them, by trying to obey them, you feel that they don't deserve that. She said the best way you can honor them is to not follow in their footsteps, but to follow God. She said the best way to honor them is to make your life count for God. And I think that was one of the greatest things I'd ever heard anyone say, because I do know people who feel they can't honor their parents because of something their parents did or allowed to happen to them. And yet they can honor them by not allowing those things from the past to pull them down, to point them in the same bad direction. They can instead forget the things that are behind and reach for the prize of the high calling of God. Now, that doesn't mean that you forget the things that happened to you. I don't think God created us to forget. I wish we could, but He didn't create us that way. But He does create us to not allow those things to pull us down. He does create us to push towards a mark, a prize of the high calling of God. After we forgive family hurts, we're also to forgive hurts from our leaders, our followers, and our peers. We're to forgive those hurts. Moses was one of the greatest leaders in the Bible. Moses led a group of millions of people who all they did, it seems, was complain. Every time you turn around, they're complaining because they're in the desert. They're complaining because they don't have water. They're complaining because they don't have food. They're blaming Moses and they want to kill him. Even his own brother and sister turn against him. Family hurts. And yet Moses continually fought God on the subject and tried to keep God from harming the children of Israel. And so here we see that we're to forgive hurts from leaders, followers, or peers. Exodus 32:31. And Moses returned unto the Lord and said, O this people have sinned a great sin, and have made for them gods of gold. Now, this is when Aaron, Moses' brother, calls for all the gold to be brought, and they create the golden calf. And then Moses, he's up on Mount Sinai, and he's getting the very laws which tell the people, don't make golden images, don't make any graven images. And here's Aaron down below, and he's building this calf of gold. Moses said, they've sinned a great sin, yet now, if thou wilt, forgive them. Moses says, if you will, please forgive these people. And if not, if you won't forgive them, Lord, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written. Moses was willing to basically give up his eternal salvation if it meant that God would forgive the people of Israel. He was willing to give anything if God would not destroy the people of Israel, because God was ready to just wipe them out and let Moses be the next person who received the blessing of the promise God had given to Abraham. And Moses said, no, if you do that, you're going to destroy your image before the peoples in these lands that are around us. And so he constantly battled with God to keep Israel from being destroyed, even though Israel probably deserved it. They probably deserved to have punishment from God in many ways, and God did send punishments to them multiple times. And yet Moses constantly tried to save them. So he says, if thou wilt, forgive their sin. Moses forgave his followers. Moses forgave his brother and sister in leading the people astray. Even when his sister received leprosy for turning against him, Moses prayed and asked God to heal her. So we forgive hurts from our followers. We can also forgive the hurts of our peers. It's very easy as young people to want our friends to look up to us, to think that we're cool, especially as teenagers. I think teenagers struggle with acceptance the most of any group of people. They want their friends to like them. They want to be popular. And so they'll follow the crowd and do whatever the crowd's doing, even if they know that what the crowd is doing is wrong. And when that crowd turns against them, they don't understand it. They get angry, they get frustrated. Some of them get so hurt that they even commit suicide. But if we learn to forgive the hurts of our peers, we won't fall into that same boat. Now, young people in college, I think they still struggle some with wanting to be accepted. I attended a Christian college, and I had hoped to get into some of the singing groups. But after a while of not being accepted into those singing groups, I realized that many of the people who were accepted, they tended to, at times, be the popular ones, or the ones that people knew their family names. And I thought, I don't want to be in that kind of situation where people look up to me only because of my family name or only because I'm popular among the other students. If I'm going to do something to help my college or to help the ministries I'm in, I'd rather be able to do it right here, right where I am. And I was able to do that. I worked with Chinese ministry for 8 years while I was in college. And I believe I made a difference in the lives of the kids that I worked with for so many years there, and the adults that I taught English there. So it was not something that I tried to continually pursue to be a name that people knew. Many times the people with the names that people knew ended up leaving school early or ended up in trouble for, minor things, but ended up in trouble. And that was because they were looking for acceptance from the wrong place. They were looking for acceptance from the wrong people. And so because of that, many of them ended up with an unforgiving spirit towards the things that happened to them in college, which might have caused them to leave or caused them to have a hard time in school. And so we learn to forgive our peers. We have to learn to forgive our leaders. When I was in college, there was a pastor, and he committed a great sin. In our eyes, we think of certain sins as great sins because we're humans. In God's eyes, every sin is just as wicked as the next, whether it be a lie or it be murder. To God, everything is a sin that is wrong and that goes against his laws that he's written down in his word. But this pastor did something, and it didn't just affect him. It didn't just affect his church. It didn't just affect the people right around him. It affected his state, the nation, and the world because of the outreach that his ministry had. And so many people that I know point their finger at him, and they say, well, he's the reason I'm not in church anymore. He's the reason I went down this path to wickedness. He's the reason that I did this or that. And while we can do that, Adam and Eve did it, God puts the blame not on him for our decisions, but on us. We cannot blame another person for the things that we do wrong. And that's why God says we need to forgive them. You forgive your leaders who fail you, whether it be in church, whether it be in college, whether it be even your parents, that you feel they failed you, whether it be that you feel you have had a leader fail you in your workplace, and maybe you feel that they've mistreated you there, they haven't honored your work, whatever it might be. If a forgiving spirit is important if we want God to forgive us. A forgiving spirit towards our followers, towards our peers, towards our leaders. We have to forgive others if we want God to forgive us. We can allow an unforgiving spirit in any of these areas to bring us down, to keep us from being close to God. But we shouldn't. God says, forgive, and I'll forgive you.